And now, stand-up community subscribers and listeners from around the globe, it's time to Stand Up with Pete Dominic, where we ask the important questions that impact you, your family, and your community. Such as, will these adult underwear really allow me to get back into life? And will climate change-induced flooding be a chance for me to show off my sweet-ass Tracker Pro 170 motorboat? And now, the podcast host who never fails to mention that, yes, he's the Monday Night Warm-Up Act, Pete Dominic.
Yeah, thank you very much, sir. That's right. Last night, performing in Boston, though I'm recording this before the performance, so I have no idea how it went or who came or who I got to meet for the first time in person, but I can't wait to talk to you about it on Wednesday. Can't wait to see you on Thursday. Please sign up for a paid subscription to this podcast because today, ladies and gentlemen, today is episode 400. That's right. We made it, and I mean we could not have done it without your support because I wouldn't be able to support my family without your paid subscriptions. So all of you who are paying subscriptions, thank you so much. It will be 2 years in November of this year. So I guess almost 2 years, really. Is November that far away? But it's been quite a ride, a journey. We've built a community around this podcast. I've been going daily since March of 2020, and I'm really enjoying it. But again, I got to keep hitting the subscription because if you don't sign up, I can't keep doing it, and I love doing it. Learning so much each and every day on this podcast. And today, because I was on the road, there's no way for me to possibly tape a news segment, but I had an awesome conversation with Tim Wise that I want to share with you, which is great because he's one of my all-time favorite guests. And I thought about what could I do for episode 400, what kind of special thing could I do? And I'm like, I'm not big on that. We don't have to make a big deal out of it. I'd love to have all kinds of different elements, but it's enough just to do a podcast every day, much less plan so far ahead for special events. Although in the future, if there's a staff, maybe we can. But right now, this is where we're at. And so coming up in just a moment, Tim Wise, but I do have to tell you about today's sponsor, and I'm really excited to share this company, this app with you because it's awesome. It's super helpful. And to all of those of you who have avoided going to the doctor recently during the pandemic or any other time, I mean, I haven't been in a year. You got to go to the dentist, get a cleaning. You didn't see the eye doctor. But now that everything is starting to open up in most places, it's time to catch up on your regular healthcare. So just download the free ZocDoc app, the easiest way to find a great doctor and instantly book an appointment. With ZocDoc, you can search for local doctors who take your insurance, read verified patient reviews, and then book an appointment in person or video chat. Never wait on hold with a receptionist again. Whether you need a primary care physician, a dentist, a dermatologist, psychiatrist, eye doctor, or other specialist, ZocDoc has you covered. Go to ZocDoc.com/standup and download the ZocDoc app to sign up for free. Every month, millions of people are using ZocDoc, and I am one of them. It's my go-to whenever I need to see a doctor. I'm looking right now for a new therapist using ZocDoc for that, and you should too. ZocDoc makes healthcare easy. Now, it's time to prioritize your health. Go to ZocDoc.com/standup and download the ZocDoc app to sign up for free and book a top-rated doctor. Many are available as soon as today. That's ZocDoc.com/standup. Okay, he's one of my favorite guests. He's one of my favorite people to read. I love reading his essays at Medium, which is where most of what we're talking about today are from Tim Wise's essays at Medium, timjwise.medium.com. He is a prolific writer, an anti-racist speaker, and educator. He is on Twitter, where he's awesome at Tim Jacob Wise. Very excited to share my latest conversation and have it be episode 400 right now. All right, there he is, Tim Wise. Welcome back. Thank you very much for joining me. Tons to talk with you about, and I want to start with what we were just talking about again. What are sundown towns?
Yeah, I mean, sundown towns are this thing that I think most Americans don't really know a lot about. And James Loewen, who did a fantastic book, Lies My Teacher Told Me, which is one of my favorite sort of correct the record history books. That was his first book, a best-selling book. He then did a couple others. One was Lies Across America, that looks at sort of historical markers and what they get wrong. And then he did Sundown Towns, which looks at these communities, the vast majority of them in the Midwest, many of them on the West Coast, really, but all over the country, where you had usually small to medium-sized communities where Black folks worked oftentimes in some of the budding industries of the early 20th century, mid 20th century. But there was an understanding that when the sun went down, Black folks were supposed to not be there any longer. And sometimes you would have the factory whistle would blow. And that was literally sort of the sign to get out of town. And there were, in some of these places, there were signs that said, inward, don't let the sun set on your black ass in blah, blah, Illinois or whatever. And I say Illinois because I think, according to Loewen, his research, are a couple hundred sundown towns in.
Yeah, I'm looking at that. You linked to it in this piece. Yeah. I'm going to tell people about in just a second. But in his piece, he writes, in the 1940s, Edmond, Oklahoma promoted itself on postcards with the slogan, "A good place to live, ... no Negroes." Yeah. In the town of Mena, Arkansas, advertised its many charms: cool summers, mild winters, no blizzards, no Negroes. This is in the 1940s.
Yeah. And, Anna, Illinois is one of the famous ones that Loewen talks about. And the rumor was, but it wasn't really just a rumor, that it essentially stood for "ain't no N-words allowed." Was what it stood for. And of course, Oregon famously in the 1840s passed legislation that essentially told, all Black folks to leave the Oregon Territory. Glendale, California was a famous sundown town. Most people would be surprised probably to learn that, unless you actually have spent any time in Southern California, and then you might know the history. So, yeah, I mean, and the reason that I mentioned it, because you mentioned that I had done so, I was doing this essay the other day for Medium, and I was trying to sort of once again figure out, like, how do I really explain systemic racism? Because we're so used to looking at racism as a sort of present day. If it's not present day, if it's not happening right now, then it ain't racism, or it's not a big deal, or we can just sort of let it go. And the point I was trying to make is, when people say, as I've had them say many, many times around the country, well, we don't really have, any racism here because there aren't any Black people, or there aren't any Latino people, or there aren't any people of color, whatever. You need to dig a little deeper. Why are there no whatever it is in your community? It's not an accident. It's not coincidence. There's a history. Sometimes it's a sundown town. Sometimes it's, expelling Black folks, as happened in Oregon. I mentioned Maine. Maine was more racially diverse 150 years ago than it is today. There used to be a large number of Black folks working in the shipbuilding industry, for instance, around the time of the Civil War. And afterward, when that moved from wood to steel, there was Black folks were being run out of the industry. They were being denied opportunities in textiles and shoemaking and rope making, which became some of the new industries there. They were barred from those. There was a multiracial but heavily Black community on Malaga Island, which is off the coast of Maine, which was destroyed. I mean, knocked to the ground, razed by state officials who didn't want it there. This is a history that, again, Vermont had the first statewide colonization society that had the goal of sending all Black people back to Africa. And so we really need to ask the questions. When a community looks a certain way, don't assume that it's just the way it is. There's probably a history of systemic ingrained injustice which lingers, And
that stuff is happening right now. It just adapts and evolves and becomes more, quote, quiet. We've talked about this in the past, but you're referring to your piece at Medium, and everything I'm talking with Tim today is referencing his recent essays at Medium, which everybody should subscribe to. You get an email whenever he publishes. Go do it right now. There's links in the show notes. But this piece is titled, "When Discussing Racism, Are You Missing the Systemic Forest for the Individual Trees? Sometimes it's what we don't see that does the most harm," and uses a wonderful photo here that is worth going to read it.
It's lovely. It's
alone. But you write in this, by teaching history linearly as opposed to thematically, we reinforce the idea that racism has a limited shelf life. It works its damage in particular periods, and then the slate is wiped clean by good people who get together to make it so. Yes, there may have been some lingering injustice or somewhat lesser form of oppression than the one before, but good people worked on it once again and made things better. Progress on this account is as inevitable as tomorrow's sunrise and has been the story of America when it comes to race. So well written, sir. I hope you don't mind me plottering through that.
That's good. No, that's great.
It's such you already touched and we went into detail on this, but basically it's just the idea that we don't know how to discuss this because we don't see it, or we see it and then it seems to go away, or we think of certain periods and they were bad and then it gets better. Where are we now in 2021?
Well, we're in a place where we still don't understand the non-linearity of that history, right? We do still teach it in this very linear way. And part of the reason we're having this backlash against anti-racist education, which they'll frame it as critical race theory, but really it's any honest conversation of institutional or systemic injustice, is because those of us who talk about it in a thematic way, where we look at history not as linear, where progress is inevitable and things are always getting better, but we look at history cyclically, right? What goes around comes the hell around if you don't deal with it. When you talk about it that way, the people who would rather us think of it as constant progress, I mean, there's a reason why they want that, right? If things are always getting better, then we don't have to do anything. Right? If things are always getting better, then you don't actually have to go to the barricade, so to speak, and fight for justice. Justice will just happen. Surely some good people will get together, and it doesn't have to be you. So we can say, well, we don't want young kids to learn about injustice. And they'll say, well, it's because we don't want to, it's too heavy and it makes them feel anxious and it makes the white kids feel guilty. But really what it is, and this is the piece that went up today.
Yeah, so good.
Really what it is you don't want kids knowing about injustice, because the thing about young people is that if you reach them with the facts and the truth before they have grown older and cynical and we've wrung all the empathy out of them the way you wring water through a towel or a sponge, then they might actually want to do something about it. You don't want them to learn about injustice because young people have an innate sense of fairness. But for some, it's better to strangle empathy in the crib before it learns to walk, so to speak. And that's where I think we are.
Yeah. What you did there to me was you went from one piece of Medium to the most recent piece, which is what I was going to ask you about next. But can I read from it again, sir? Would you mind
Please.
All right, here I go. Wait, this one is so good. Oh, it's so good because it's kind of the what I've been really desperately wanting someone to kind of frame and write about this concern about education in America right now. It's titled "Banning Anti-Racist Education Isn't About Protecting Kids, It's About Pacifying Them. Truth is dangerous," which is why some people prefer covering it up. All right, here is the my favorite 2 paragraphs. Here I go, Tim. Please, you can tell me. You can give me a score.
No, that's fine. It's wonderful.
Right. In truth, however, the right doesn't seek to protect children so much as pacify them. Conservatives know that when young people learn of injustice, especially before we've given them the tools to rationalize it and justify inequities it spawned, their innate sense of fairness typically compels them to take action. And that's the problem. Learning how social structures have perpetrated inequity leads students to seek to change them. But that means altering arrangements that benefit those on top of the pile. And if the system is working for you, you won't likely embrace a growing awareness that it might be harming others. Far better to strangle empathy as a baby before it learns to walk. Wow-wee, sir. Those are some words you put together there.
Thank you. Yes, I do put together words. That's for sure. Yeah. I actually wrote all these pieces. It's funny. I wrote them, and this is good because I've been sort of really ill lately. Not COVID for those who were listening, but I haven't been feeling so well. So I wrote most of these a while ago, and they've just sort of been sitting, waiting to be put up, because you're always trying to figure out how do I game the algorithm and get this to actually be seen on Medium. Sometimes they do, sometimes they don't. So this one had been sitting there, and I'm finally like, all right, let's just send it out. So I scheduled it for going out today, and I hadn't read it in a while, from the time that I saw it. So it sounds good when you read it back to me.
Oh, good. I loved it. I literally just screen grabbed it and shared it on Twitter, that whole passage, because I think it's, a guy who writes the way that you write, it's hard to just grab, as good as you are actually on Twitter. I still think, having a little bit more context gives it a bit more credit. But let's go to that piece because, help me understand. Like, I've never felt I've never hated myself for my whiteness. I've never, and this idea that parents are saying it, this education, whatever they want to call it, they don't know what they're talking about. But the idea that you could teach white children to hate themselves, I don't really buy that. And I'm really trying to be open-minded. Maybe there's a way to do that. I know you can do that, and it has been done to marginalized communities for sure, but it just doesn't seem, I don't buy this.
Well, look, I mean, I have no doubt. And in that article, I do, in fact, tell a story about some of my own awakening to some of this, and I've talked about this before, being 8 years old in 1977 and reading Alex Haley's Roots during the time that the miniseries was out. It affected me profoundly to hear this story of the history of enslavement in this one family and in America more broadly. And it affected me, in part because being a Southerner, I knew that was also my story on the other side of that. Was there a time when I probably was like, oh, God, oh, shit. And when I traced my family tree, I realized, good Lord, my family owned other. Yes, that of course happened. That's a natural human instinct, by the way. When you find out that you're implicated or your family that you love is implicated in suffering, a natural non-sociopathic human being is going to go, oh, my God, that's terrible. But did that cripple me to the point where I'm like, oh, I now am incapable of having compassion for white people, or now I hate my whiteness? No, because what I knew even at 8 was that this can't be how all white people thought. This can't be something that all white people thought was okay, because I'm sitting here and saying it's not. Surely there had to be other white people even then who said it wasn't. And that's when I started to try to find out about those white people. And that's when, I traced my family tree and I found out that there were white folks that had been enslavers. And then there was also a white person in that same family that was an abolitionist. So there's a lot of different ways to live in this skin. And when white kids learn about the bad part of that in our past, there's going to be that initial feeling of like, oh, God, the good news is, right. And I'm working on a piece to this effect now that will be out sometime, trying to put the finishing touches on it. It's probably about halfway done. That there are also examples of white folks acting in solidarity, saying no to that. So if you really do worry about white kids feeling guilt or shame, there's a really easy solution, conservatives. There's a really easy solution. Make sure that we're teaching about white anti-racist allyship to young kids, because then they'll realize they have a different path. But you know what? The conservatives that say they're worried about white kids feeling guilty, they don't want to teach them about that. You think they want to teach them about white folks that were in the freedom rides? You think you want to teach them about white abolitionists? You want to teach them about Jeremiah Everts, who was one of the white men that stood up against Andrew Jackson and thought that the removal of indigenous people was an ungodly act and wrote about it? No, you don't want to know. You'd rather talk about Jackson. You don't want to talk about the white folks that thought he was full of crap. You don't want to talk about Lydia Marie Child. You don't want to talk about the Grimke sisters. You don't want to talk about John Fee, who was a Presbyterian minister who got defrocked from his church and from the Presbyterian Synod because he refused to minister to enslavers. These are also white people. So if white kids were learning about them, if they had different role models within their own racial group, then we wouldn't have to fetishize George Washington and Thomas Jefferson and Andrew Jackson and people like that. We'd have different role models. That'll handle the guilt problem. But how many right wingers are gonna actually talk about those folks? No, they don't want to, because if I tell an 11-year-old about those white allies, they might want to be a white ally now. And these people don't want more white allies and more white folks fighting racism. They want white people to just accept things the way they are, which is why, I led off the piece that ran today with that quote from James Baldwin, that most societies don't want people who can think for themselves. They want people who obey.
Yeah, it's so important. And talking about the way certain people want education taught in America, you referenced this idea. I think Trump has said this, others have said this, patriotic education, which has, echoes of fascist past. And we've been reading a lot of historians writing about that kind of thing, how history should be taught, much less how the present should be reported. But Mike Pompeo tweeted on July 5th as a reaction to, people's reactions to Independence Day, 4th of July. He tweeted, "If we teach that the founding of the United States of America was somehow flawed, it was corrupt, it was racist, that's really dangerous. It strikes the very foundations of our country."
Right.
I don't know what the question I want to ask you about that
I know
tweet
what the answer is to the question that you want. Look, here's the thing. By definition, it was flawed. That's why we have amendments, right? Like if the founding wasn't flawed, there would have been no reason to go back and be like, oh shit, we forgot some stuff. Let's put this in, right? Like you wouldn't do that. You would just be like, this is a flawless, perfect document. No, the fact that we had to have a civil war, well, we didn't have to, but the South said we did because we are so desperate to hold on to our black people as property that we're willing to secede and precipitate it. We ended up losing 600 to 700,000 people precisely because we didn't have our shit together. So the idea that it somehow besmirches the good name of America to acknowledge what any rational person can see, which is that the Constitution was written in a way that told Southerners, hey, if your property runs away to the North, the North has to return it. That's in the Constitution. I know it doesn't say slave or enslavement because they were very slick about that. But the Constitution says very clearly, if you read it clearly, that, you know, fugitive enslaved people have to be returned to their rightful quote unquote owners. The first thing that I've mentioned this on your show before, the first thing that was passed when the Congress met after the Constitution was ratified was the Naturalization Act of 1790, which said all free white persons and only free white persons could be citizens. Clearly, if the very first order of business is to carve out a special space for white people, that's a flaw in the system, right? So it's not wrong to acknowledge that. It's ridiculous not to acknowledge it. We have to be willing to acknowledge that, or else we make no progress whatsoever. It's like, you know, I got 2 daughters. I know you're a father of children and daughters as well. They're great. They're 20 and 18. They're fabulous. They were also pretty cool when they were 10 and 8. But I got to tell you, when they're 30 and 20 or 30 and 28, I hope that they're better than they are right now. And if they don't make progress in the next decade, we're going to have a talk, right? Like, I need them to get better. And when I say in 10 years, if they haven't, like, hey, you know, you got, I don't know about this. That's not because I hate them. That's because I love them and expect better of them. Well, the same is true with the country, right? When we say there were flaws, we only say it because we think we're capable of fixing them, right? There are certain flaws that you and I and other people have, and we know we ain't never going to get it together. So we don't even bother, right? There's just some shit that's going to be who we are, and it's just the way it is. But there are other things that we know we can improve on. The same is true with the country. So Pompeo is playing to a base, you know, that wants that quote unquote patriotic, really cheerleader education. It's basically history class as cheerleader camp. Right. It's basically like, let's just get out the pom-poms, just, you know, and the truth is that's when people do that, they to me, they hate their country because what they're saying is we can't do any better. You know what? White folks average 12 to 15 times the net worth of black people. We can't do any better than that.
Or we blame them for not trying hard enough. They're just not trying.
And ultimately, the opposite of acknowledging systemic racism, as I wrote in another piece that ran not long ago, the opposite of that is blaming black people. If it ain't America, then you're blaming black people.
Right.
So which one of those is more problematic? Because these people that criticize critical race theory and anti-racist, they'll say, well, it's racist to say white people have privilege because you're judging. Actually, it's not, because that's a sociological assessment. It's either true or false, but it's not a characterological judgment, right? If I say white people have privilege, I might be wrong if you want to make an argument, but it's not, I'm not judging white people. I'm not saying that white people are somehow flawed inherently or culturally or biologically, and that's why they have privilege. It's a sociological judgment, either true or false. But if you don't agree that systemic racism, past and present, is why we have racial disparity, then the only answers you have left are the ones that say black people are broken. And how in the hell is that not racist? If you're going to say it's racist to say white people have privilege, but it's not racist to say black people are culturally defective, please explain that one to me, because it doesn't make any sense.
You write in this piece, by lying to children and themselves, conservatives seek more than control over telling of history. They seek control over the making of it from this point forward. It's up to the rest of us to stop them by insisting that our children are capable of handling the truth and desperately in need of learning it, as are we all. I mean, we can all, I suppose, reasonably disagree on what should be being taught in terms of history. You have just so much time. You have just so much, so many resources. But what the effort right now is on the right, it is to whitewash our history from in the past and from this point on. And, what the left wants more likely is, how would you describe, what the rest of us really want to be taught in our schools, Tim?
Well, I mean, look, just the very fact that we fetishize this concern about white kids' feelings or white parents, they're going to feel bad if you tell them about, injustice. But we interestingly don't seem to care about, if we don't talk about it, then how do black and brown kids feel, right? So we don't even think about that. Like, we don't even ask the question, well, what does it mean to be black growing up in a society that never, ever confronts the truth? Because if I'm a black kid and all I know is I can see the inequities that exist, man, you don't have to be a sociologist or an anthropologist. You just got to be awake and paying attention. White kids, black kids, brown kids, all kids can look around and say, I can see the inequities of who's going to jail. I can see it on TV, on the news. I can see this side of town has better infrastructure than this side of town. This school over here, I know, has more resources than this school. So if you're the black kid or the kid of color, or for that matter, you could be a poor white kid. And if we're not talking about class and we're not talking about the economic system, and you're wondering, why is it that my stuff is like this and my community is in this shape and that community is in better shape? And if we're not talking about the systemic reasons for that and the historical context, that black kid is going to blame himself or his parents or his community. It becomes easy to then internalize.
And they do. There's a lot of research that psychological research that they absolutely do blame themselves for that situation they're in, right?
Right. And in fact, our country tells us all, right, wherever you end up is all about your own efforts. Right. So because we have that fetishizing of rugged individualism, not only does that encourage white people to think of ourselves as superior and rich people of whatever race to think of themselves as superior, it tells lower income folks of all colors, and it tells black and brown folk who are disproportionately in working class and lower categories that they're flawed. So we ought to be, nobody has an interest in any kid feeling guilt or shame. Guilt and shame are shitty emotions. They rarely inspire us to do better. They're not very helpful. But the reality is that if you don't talk about injustice, you encourage guilt and shame among the marginalized. If you don't talk about it, you make them wonder what's wrong with them. So we have to tell the truth. And then what we can do, and I've told kindergarten teachers this, you don't want black kids to think of themselves as permanent victims, and you don't want white kids to think of themselves as permanent or even necessary victimizers. But the way you avoid that is not by avoiding the topic. You talk about it, but you do two things. You talk about white solidarity and allyship so that white kids know they have choices, and you talk about black resistance and brown resistance. In other words, you don't teach history as just a compendium of oppression. You talk about the resistance that black and brown people have brought in response, the perseverance, the overcoming of obstacles. But you can't praise overcoming obstacles if you don't talk about the damn obstacles. It's like these people that say, well, critical race theory doesn't acknowledge all the progress. Bullshit. Critical race theory actually says that we should be amazed at the progress given the obstacles that have been in the way of those who have made that progress. You cannot appreciate how far the country has come to the extent that we have unless you are willing to acknowledge the depths of depredation whence we started, right? And so if you're Mike Pompeo and you're saying everything was cool, then how can you even appreciate the progress? Why didn't need progress? Or how the hell can you talk about, well, we need to make progress when you're saying MAGA? Because the whole point of MAGA is there ain't nothing to improve, man. We had this shit together before. Why don't we just go back to? So you can't have it both ways. You can't say that look how far we've come. And by the way, we didn't really need to make all that effort because we were doing pretty damn good 100 years ago. Don't you?
So well said, so well framed. To be fair to Mike Pompeo, he is on record as saying that he's really is at his target weight.
Okay, I have nothing there.
I'm just going to stare at you for a while on that joke. Yeah. He thinks he's at his. So the other piece I wanted to ask you about at Medium, timjwise.medium.com. Go subscribe if you haven't. It's all in the show notes. You got to. I love reading Tim's stuff. I can't wait till it comes out. Is titled, "And Now We'd Like to Call Your Attention to the Scary Black Man, How Ice-T became the first right-wing meme, and the GOP went all in as a white grievance cult." And if anybody doesn't know who White Ice-T is, we're talking about an actual person. What was his actual real name? Tracy?
Yeah, it's Tracy.
Everybody knows Ice-T. I don't have to explain. I shouldn't have said anything. Anyway, the point is, take us back, Tim, to 1992. You're living in Houston with your then girlfriend. Now, did you marry this woman eventually? You did not. So you were living with a woman before you met your wife.
I lived with a couple of women before.
Oh, okay. Well, I'd love to read the Medium piece about those relationships and what happened.
Yeah.
But you're living with this woman. She gets a deal. She's an interior decorator. She gets a contract to decorate the RNC, which is there in Houston, where you're living at the time. George H.W. Bush had been where he would be nominated for re-election. And you helped her out that day in the arena, and you walked in and you saw an image of Ice-T, the original meme, you say. Take us to 92 and why it matters.
So, yeah, my girlfriend had this contract to do the VIP lounges at the Astrodome, which is where the RNC was being held. She also got the contract to decorate the Bush residence, which was actually not their residence. They lived in Maine, but they used Texas. They didn't have to pay income tax, state income tax. Their residence was a hollowed out game room at the Houstonian Hotel. I shit you not. And we also brought furniture in there and set it up. And there's a whole lot of, I talk about that in my book, White Like Me, that it was fascinating. We were 23, 24 years old. We were sweaty, gross, grimy, bringing all this shit in a beat up Toyota Tercel. And they just waved us right through. Didn't even ask for proof that we were, we're going in to set up the president of the United States residence, quote unquote. We could have put a bomb in the room. We could, and they didn't search us. They didn't search any of the furniture. So talk about white privilege. But the Astrodome story, what was fascinating was the first day of the convention, August 17th of 92, we're bringing stuff in. We're only going to be there for about an hour. We didn't have to do that much to it. But as we walk in and people are starting to come in, it's not going to really get going for a few hours, but there are already delegates coming in. And I look up on the Jumbotron above the main hall, and there's this picture of Tracy Morrow, Ice-T, the rapper, who at that time, there was a lot of controversy because his speed metal band Body Count had a song out that spring called Cop Killer, which had created this huge uproar. Dan Quayle got in on it. All these folks were condemning him for this song. And it had been a big news story. So I see his face, and it was from a news, maybe a CNN segment or something. There was a chyron at the bottom that said something about gangsta rap, which was interesting because, again, it was not a rap song. He is a rapper, but he also had this speed metal band, still does, Body Count. And this is at a time, again, this is before Ice-T was doing Tide detergent commercials and before he was on Law and Order SVU.
Right. Before he crossed over to kind of a more acceptable role.
Yeah, it's sort of like Ice Cube, right? It was like Ice Cube in NWA is very different than Ice Cube in the Friday movies and the way people know him now. And not that I'm critiquing either guy, because they, their hustle is their hustle and they've done very well. And I think they're both still amazing hip hop artists. But he was at that time viewed as this really, dangerous black guy. And so by putting that face up there, and I remember seeing it thinking, that's an interesting choice, right? Like this is what the delegates are going to be greeted by. Like they could have put Reagan's face up there. They could have put like some flags. They could have, the Gulf War I had just ended or whatever. And they could have put soldiers returning, and they chose that. And I started thinking about what is that about? Well, keep in mind what also was going on at the time, right, was the LA uprising had just happened in late April, early May. And
Rodney King.
Right. Rodney King, the 4 officers acquitted for beating Rodney King, that had just happened. And also in April, right before the verdict in that case, a Texas state trooper had been murdered by a young black guy whose lawyer then blamed Tupac Shakur for the killing. Basically said, well, my client was listening to Tupac's first album, Tupacalypse Now, and there's a song in there about killing a cop, and that's why he did it. This didn't work, by the way, in court, but that was the attempt. And so there was all of this uproar about hip hop and rap music, all this uproar about black criminality. And so to have that picture up there, and this is before memes, obviously, it's before really, the internet in any real way, shape or form for, public consumption and usage. But that was a meme. That was a way of showing a photo with a chyron mentioning gangster rap and letting people know this guy's the enemy, not Bill Clinton. Bill Clinton had just been nominated the previous month at the Democratic convention, but that wasn't him and it wasn't Hillary. Like it was Ice-T. Like that's the dude. That's what we're fighting. And then that night, as I mentioned in the piece, was when Pat Buchanan got up and gave what is now this very infamous culture war speech, where he talked about L.A. and he ends the speech by saying how he went to South Los Angeles and talked to the National Guardsmen who had just bravely defended an old folks' home from a marauding band of thugs who were going to molest old people. His literal words: they're going to molest old people during the L.A. riots riots, LA uprising. This story was bullshit. This isn't what happened. The people at that nursing home said it was bullshit, but it was all part of this attempt, even in 92, for the Republicans to say, you know what? This tax cut thing, this free trade shit, all this stuff we've been talking about for all these years, thinking that our base like reads Milton Friedman, thinking that our base reads Ayn Rand, thinking that our base gives a shit about like supply side economics and libertarian monetary theory and Frederick Hayek. Our base, that's not them, man. Our base is this right here: white resentment, white anxiety, white grievance. And so even in 92, I remember saying, yeah, this Reaganism thing doesn't have a long shelf life. They're going to replace it with something. And of course, I had just finished doing the anti-David Duke work in Louisiana, where we saw how effective a politic of racial resentment could work and get 6 out of 10 white people to vote for a guy who they knew was a Nazi. And we were sitting there trying to tell people, y'all, this is going national. And they're like, nah, man, that's Louisiana. Y'all are different. Y'all are just different. Right. And so now we know. And as I said in that piece, you didn't know what the baby was going to become as an adult. But now we know. This is what it's grown into. And so, yeah, there's a long history to race politics. But that day, August 17th of 1992, to me is the day when the party said, we're going to go all in on this shit. And they've been doing it consistently since. I think my personal overall reaction to reading that piece and talking about 1992 and connecting that with the earlier piece that we talked about in terms of like the linear and the cyclical stuff, the way that this stuff happens, it was, I guess, I've been reading you and talking to you for over 10 years now and several others as well. But it's like a lot of people are coming to this conclusion that a lot of this stuff is new, or, I'm thinking of the Republicans, many of which I've now had on this show, but that are saying, I don't know what happened to my party. Right. These anti-Trumpers, they're Republican conservatives, anti-Trumpers. I'm thinking of like, I'll just shout out Charlie Sykes or others like this. And I'm like, I've been reading Tim Wise. I've been talking to black folks, being around them. Like, this is not new. You just laid it out here. This is 92. Racial politics have always been a thing, but they, as I said earlier, they evolve, they morph. And now it almost seems like, Tim, maybe there's just more cameras, but like white people are doing the most racist shit all the time. Just those scenarios that we describe, which are always the definition of racism that most people agree to. But more importantly, all this systemic stuff is getting worse simply by the fact that we're trying to take history out of schools. And more importantly, take the vote again. So yeah, my question is, I don't understand why some of these Republicans are acting like, well, I don't know what happened to my party. Like, you've been writing about this forever. They've always been using race and been racist. Right. I mean, this begins, it begins before 92, but, sure, but I think crystallizes then. But in 64, when Barry Goldwater came south looking for votes, and he would, Barry Goldwater was not a bigot. He was not an overt racist by any stretch, but he was like a libertarian who just had this really ridiculously naive view that the government, shouldn't ban discrimination in the private sector because property owners have the right to dispense of their property however they see fit. So he was opposed to the Civil Rights Act on philosophical grounds, which practically is still racist to me in effect. But
Ron Paul still held that point of view.
Same Ron Paul, Rand Paul shit. Yeah, John Stossel's on that. That's like the libertarian thing, whatever. We could debate that philosophically. I think it's bankrupt as hell. But here's the thing. When he came south and he tried to campaign on like libertarian stuff, like he said, we should privatize the Tennessee Valley Authority, which is the utility, right? We should privatize them because the government needs to get. And white folks in the South were like, hold up, wait now. You want to turn the utilities over to some multi-billion-dollar company headquartered in New York City? The hell, boy. Why don't you just talk? Can you just talk about, the N words? Can we just talk about them for a minute? And then he was like, oh, okay, well, then let me make this about the Civil Rights Act and about government overreach and about states' rights. So he got the message. And then ever since then, whether we're talking Nixon Southern strategy, whether we're talking about, Lee Atwater in 1981, famously saying on tape, acknowledging as a Republican consultant that the game for years, and he was still playing the game at that point. This is before he got cancer and repented for his sins. He was still in it. He was saying, look, back in the 50s, you start out saying N-word, 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 and pretty soon by 68, you can't say that anymore. So you got to come up with all these code words. So you start talking about taxes and busing and states' rights. But really, all that is trying to hurt black people and not acknowledge that that's what you're doing. I mean, he's on tape saying that. So how the hell does Charlie Sykes and Jennifer Rubin and all these guys, how all these people not know that that's who they were, and look, I'm all for them having this come to Jesus moment or whatever. But if you're going to have that moment, you got to at least acknowledge the road that you were walking all of that time, right? If you're going to have your Paul on the road to Damascus moment, let's acknowledge whence you come, and let's not pretend that you came from this real high-minded philosophical place. Because if the best you got is, well, we're the party of Lincoln. It's like, what did D.L. Hughley say? When you keep having to point to the guy on the penny as the best you got, like, you're sort of in trouble, right?
Well, it also seems to really be manifesting, and I don't know how much we can correlate these statistics, but it does seem like a huge percentage of the people who actually attacked the Capitol that were actual insurrectionists, and I would argue it probably extends to Trumpers in general, come from communities where there'd recently been more minorities moving into those communities. And it would seem that the backlash is one about the black and brown folks moving into their communities, them seeing it and reacting thusly versus. So it's the point is that stuff is still working. Those issues are still the most animating issues. So, of course, smart politicians, bankrupt politicians are going to use that. Is that what we're seeing now, right now?
I think that's absolutely true. This strategy, it's rational. It's not irrational. And one of the things that liberals sometimes can't get our heads around, or their heads around, because I'm to the left of liberalism, but people that are progressive sometimes think, well, racism is irrational, so surely people will come to realize the irrationality if we point it out. But in fact, it works, right? I mean, it pays. It has worked for a long time for certain people. Now, the reality is, as the demographics and as the culture change, there are diminishing returns, which is why you have to ramp it up, right? It used to be that the dog whistling of Reagan and Bush the first, and even Bush the second, was good enough. But now you sort of got to air horn it because, you're trying to really rally the troops. And then you're trying to do three things. You're trying to, limit protest and tell people you can run over protesters in your car. We're also going to limit who can vote. And we're going to limit what the kids learn in school, because those are the three arenas that democracy relies on, right? The streets, the ballot box, and the classroom. And if you can control those three things, then you can stifle any chance for multicultural democracy. That's where we are, and that's where the battle has to be fought.
And that is where we will end today. Tim, thank you so much for joining me. I really appreciate it. Always great to talk to you, and I will talk to you soon, sir.
Sounds good, man.
All right, there he goes, Tim Wise, at Tim Jacob Wise on Twitter. Read him at Medium. Get all of his books. Let him know you heard him here. Support him on Patreon. Thank you for supporting me on Patreon. Hello to Rick Bruner, who just subscribed while I am recording this. Hey, Rick, welcome to our community. Psyched to have you. Look forward to hearing more about you, and I need to welcome all the latest subscribers and would love to talk to anybody who wants. Just reach out. We could set up a time. standupwithpete@gmail.com. If I owe you a call, remind me. Pete, you owe me a call. Let's go, and I will get on it right away. Special thanks to my sponsor today, ZocDoc, ZocDoc.com/standup. As always, thank you to Pete Coe for doing the announcements and John Carroll for the theme music. Follow them at Pete Coe, B-O, and at JDCarroll88 on Twitter. Connect with them there. Okay, I hope to see you Thursday night. I thank you very much for joining me today. See you tomorrow at the Hangout. If you are a subscriber, I'm still in a very positive place. Been pretty stressful and had a lot of things going on lately, but I'm staying gold, as Vicky tells me to do. Staying gold. I hope you are too, and I'll talk to you soon. Tomorrow, I hope. Bye-bye. Take it away, John Carroll.
Don't get up off of your butt, down off of your fence, and even if it ain't a very friendly audience, well, they'll begin to listen when you start making sense, and you stand up, stand up. No need to point your rifle to defend your town, just stand up, stand up. You know they can't deny you what you're laying down. Oh, face of every color, yellow, black, red, and brown. She's the place where every lost child will finally be found. There's only one thing to do before we stand our ground, and that's stand up. Stand up. Well, the founding fathers saw a land for all. They had to stand up. They had to stand up. They had a keen imagination for a crystal ball, drawing all the plans of a stand up. But all they had to go on was the time they were in, with other causes for laws, and since they weren't even sin, they knew that change was gonna come before the change could begin. They had to stand up. All right, they had to stand up. We got to stand up. We got to look the devil square in the eye. We gotta let him know it's his time to go, and make it clear when all we hear is a lie. Why you lying awake wondering where the money all went? It'll be the cost of freedom that'll go unspent. You can see him flee the scene of that experiment if you stand up. All right, we got to speak up, we got to reach up and raise your voice in every way you know how. Don't be toes up, you got to show up. Ain't no better time to do it but now. No need to pledge allegiance to no wanton tribe. Rise up, show obedience to the voice inside, and listen well and it'll tell you not to run and hide. It says stand up.